If you are a student of political science, history, or economics, you cannot escape from dealing with the great German philosopher and revolutionary Karl Marx, no matter whether you agree with Marxian worldview or not. Of course, Marxism is increasingly regaining its relevance today, thanks to the challenges faced by the current capitalist world order and ever widening polarization in terms of wealth concentration. Historical materialism, a materialist conception of human history as envisaged by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, helps us as a philosophy, tool, and methodology all at the same time to understand the multitude of dialectical forces at play that define the direction of our society in its forward march. It not only explains why history hitherto has taken the path that it has traversed till date, but also enlightens us about the inevitability of a better and egalitarian society that man is destined to create eventually for himself. Historical materialism not only uncovers the motivations and driving forces behind various social changes the history has witnessed till date, but also establishes a framework and a theoretical formulations for realizing the dream of building a just society devoid of exploitation, suffering, and class antagonism. This course on historical materialism provides its student a clear understanding of what is historical materialism, its key propositions, and why it is increasingly relevant in today's social climate. Since the time human race appeared on the surface of the earth, there have been lots of changes in the environment in which man lived and also the way or how they lived. In retrospect, one would be astonished to look at the character, content, and impact of some of the unbelievable events and changes the human species had witnessed over the course of the long journey till date. The human history, starting from the very primitive era where they hunted animals together in the jungles for food, gradually learning to domesticate animals and transforming into a pastoral society, making various types of tools and acting on nature with them to survive and sustain, and then stumbling upon the great invention of agriculture. And at this end of the long journey, today's hugely complex world of far advanced science and technology will amaze anyone. Similarly, societal structure and power hierarchies, social institutions, laws, customs, values and rituals, beliefs, all have undergone unrecognizable transformation and have evolved over time. Social sciences focus on exploring the history of human development. Social sciences try to unravel various human endeavors of different historical epochs, inquiring into the task, purpose, and governing social laws that were driving those endeavors. This branch of social science tries to figure out why history traversed the path it did and what made it to choose the same. On the other hand, the natural sciences focus on the objects that are the subjects of human action and the natural forces that drive various interactions between those objects. It is investigating how those objects can be used for the purpose of meeting the needs of human life. It's not within their scope to define what that purpose is. That task is taken up by the social sciences. Historical materialism, as a social science stream, is fulfilling this job and examines the history of human development from a perspective of dialectical materialism, identifying the key forces and actors in there and formulating the general laws of social development. Some section, however, would argue that we cannot formulate the laws of social changes the same way we define the laws of motion that govern processes and forces in the nature. This is because while the mechanical motions of bodies and their mechanical interactions repeat exactly the same way every single time as per the laws of motion, each incident in the history is unique and the same social situations never manifest themselves in the same way second time. They are of the view that it's futile to try to discover the laws that govern social processes or social changes. Those who tend to disagree with this argument are of the view that the basic processes that are essential for the survival and sustenance of any society and the relation that get forged among its members to enable those processes exist in all the societies in one way or the other. And if one can carefully examine the nature of these relations, an underlying pattern would emerge. And a general set of laws governing those developments can be evolved. The historical materialism is a reading of the human history that follows later school of thought. It evolves the general laws by investigating into the processes and relations established in societies that enable them to produce goods that are essential for their material existence. In other words, historical materialism is a materialistic conception of history. Historical materialism explores answers to the questions like why history did choose the path it traveled. In other words, why was the human history not in some other way than what it is as we know now? Are the events in the history happening purely random, accidentally, without any relation to each other? Or can we spot certain patterns or behavior in the events of different eras? What drove history in its path? What were the forces and reasons behind many of the revolutionary and course-changing transformations in the past? Just like how the natural phenomena are driven by certain laws, the social phenomena also follow certain laws. And if there are laws that define history, can we predict the direction going forward based on such general laws? Historical materialism provides answers to these questions. Historical materialism may be defined as the general theory of the motive forces and laws of social changes developed on the basis of Marx's discoveries, arrived at by applying the materialist world outlook to the solution of social problems. Just like how various phenomena in the nature are analyzed using dialectical method, as per historical materialism, the developments and changes in societies also can be understood and described following the method of dialectics. We will do an in-depth treatment on dialectical materialism in a separate course. The historical materialism proposes that the turns and events in history don't happen accidentally. Instead, they follow certain rules and cause-effect relations and then proceeds to define those laws, specifying the dialectical forces acting behind the social development and changes. It is an inquiry into whether there is anything common in terms of relationships that exist in all the societies. That's very essential for the existence of social life and existence of human being that led Marx to the discovery of the basic laws of social development. As part of this inquiry, historical materialism is analyzing societies, social lives, and its evolution and history from the viewpoint of dialectical materialism. That is, historical materialism is the dialectical reading of the history of the development of human societies. It not only simply reads or interprets the past history of human social life, but also it provides a blueprint to create new history which would take human to a better egalitarian society devoid of exploitation. Let us examine what are those fundamental forces and motivations that drive social changes as per the tenets of historical materialism. It goes without saying that the first thing man needs to do to survive is to make available the essential stuffs required to sustain the life. Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist, divides human needs into 5 categories. He has arranged the hierarchy of human needs into a pyramid with 5 different slabs placed one above the other, with the basic needs forming the base or bottom slab of the pyramid. The base of the pyramid consists of the physiological needs, the likes of food, water, clothes, housing, rest, etc. The second layer from the bottom consists of safety and security needs, which include personal safety, financial security, job security, social security, health, well-being, social stability, etc. These bottom 2 layers together form the basic human needs as per Maslow. The next 2 layers above the basic needs are the psychological needs, which include love, friendship, family, relations, the third layer, and respect, self-esteem, status, prestige, recognition, sense of accomplishment, etc., the fourth layer. The fifth and the last layer of the pyramid is the self-actualization, or the desire for self-expression. This layer represents man's eagerness to enhance his creativity and desire to achieve one's full potential. With the hierarchy of the needs arranged like a pyramid, one of the key observations Maslow made is that unless the needs in the lower layer of the pyramid are met, at least to a reasonable extent, man cannot think about the needs in the higher layers. This is precisely what Marx also has suggested when he remarked, men must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history. Maslow also theorized that when the needs in the lower layer of the pyramid are not met, a strong motivation is created to achieve those needs. It is this natural instinct or motivation in human which drives him to engage in the process of producing the material objects required to satisfy his basic needs, the ones that make the 2 bottom layers of Maslow's pyramid. Before involving in any other realms of human activities like religion, politics, arts, literature, culture, etc., man needs to satisfy his basic needs. So the first set of activities that man needs to engage is the ones associated with producing things to satisfy his basic needs. An individual cannot do this all by self, as one cannot produce everything that he or she needs by his or her labor alone without the help of others. People will have to come together to work as a group for producing the essential material things. Thus, the process of production becomes a social process. This coming together for producing materials essential for man's sustenance is the basic driving force behind the formation of societies. Without this social production process, no human life is possible. Let's examine the social process of production and how it drives the social development as perceived by the historical materialism. We have stated that it is the necessary condition of human life that people should produce their means of subsistence, and since each person cannot produce the whole of his material needs by himself, solely by his own labor, without any help from others, people come together to produce things to satisfy their material needs, and thus the production process always becomes a social process. It is this association that gives birth to societies. In other words, the necessary condition for any society is that people should associate to produce their material means of subsistence. There can be no human life without this collective action on nature, and thus the social production process is the primary process of social life. As man is collectively working on nature for producing means of subsistence and to satisfy his basic needs or to improve the materialistic living conditions, or in other words, the economic conditions, their work is not only on nature but also on one another. Men who come together as part of this production process enter into social relations in order to do production and exchange of what they produce. Master and slave, lord and serf, capitalist and workers are all examples of these relations. The method of producing and distributing essential goods in a society, along with the relations formed to enable these processes, is called the mode of production. Every society will have its own mode of production. The social structure or social order in a society is established based on or according to the mode of production prevailing in that society. How a production happens and how the produce is distributed defines the relationship between the people involved in the production process, as well as who gets what out of all that is produced. The mode of production has two key components. First is the material means and labor power required to undertake the production. Second is the mutual relations that people enter into to produce and exchange products. One needs tools, machines, technology, etc. to do the production. Apart from these instruments of production, as those don't produce anything by themselves, there should be people, labor power with the necessary knowledge and skills to do the production using these instruments. These together are called forces of production, FOP. In addition to the forces of production, one also needs raw materials, land, factory buildings, etc. to run the production process. So all the means which are necessary to produce finished products, including the instruments, labor and other stuffs, together is termed as means of production or MOP. A group of people join together and engage in production utilizing the forces of production. They form relationships among themselves in order to effect a division of work and make the production process efficient. This is not something that is done consciously, but happens spontaneously as necessitated by the existing forces of production. These relations, in fact, define things like who does what job, who has the ownership on the means of production, who gets what share of the produce, or how the produce is distributed, etc. These relations are hence called relations of production or ROP. Thus, the mode of production, MOP, in a society consists of FOP, the forces of production, and ROP, the relations of production. It is the process of people entering into relations in order to do production of essential goods using the forces of production existing at the time. The sum total of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of a society, as it is the nature of these relations and one's position or role in these relations which decides what share of produce of the social wealth one would receive. Quoting Marx and Engels, social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production. And in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social relations. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, and the steam mill give you the society with industrial capitalists. These relations are not formed by any deliberate or conscious act of anyone, and neither the people are entering into a contract consciously. These relations evolve spontaneously so that people can engage in production with the forces of production and regulate the process of production and exchange or distribution of the goods so produced. One cannot choose the mode of production independently, as one has to learn and accept the system he or she is born into and learn to work with it to earn his or her living. The emergence of new forces of production, technology or machines, etc., and of the relations of production corresponding to those forces of production does not take place outside an existing system. It rather arises within the old system itself. It takes place not as a result of the deliberate or conscious activity of man, but spontaneously, but independently of the will of man. And this is because of two reasons. One is that men are not free to choose one or the other mode of production. Because as every new generation enters life, it finds productive forces and relations of production already existing as a result of the work of former generations. So it is forced at first to accept and adapt itself to everything it finds already in place to be able to produce material values. Secondly, when man develops or improves any of the instrument of production, he does not realize or think about what social changes or impact these improvements will make, but only thinks of his immediate material interest, including making his labor easier and securing some benefits or advantages for himself. But his work, without his knowledge, leads to the development of productive forces and contribute to the ultimate emergence of new forces of production and corresponding relations of production, or in other words, a new mode of production. People involved in the production process not only enter into relation with one another, but also with the means of production or properties that is integral part of the production process. This gives rise to property relations. In other words, in social production process, means of production become properties of various individuals or groups of individuals as private properties. Thus, the position or role of an individual in the process of production is determined by his or her ownership rights on the means of production. Property relations takes various forms as owner of the land, owner of the factory, or serf who doesn't own any land but working on the lord's land, workers working in a factory owned by a capitalist, etc. Everyone experiences their position in the relations of production in the form of the property relations. In short, it is the relation of production existing in a society that is determining its basic economic structure. The share of the produce one gets is determined based on the nature of one's relations with the means of production. Naturally, those who own means of production will get major chunk of the share, and those without ownership will get lesser share. As the efficiency of the producers increases, or in other words, when the productivity of the workers increases, more products are produced than what is required to satisfy the needs of the owners and the workers involved. This makes part of the produce as surplus. Putting in another way, all that is needed to satisfy the requirements of owners and workers involved in the production process can be produced with a fraction of the labor put in by the workers, and hence the remaining labor that the workers put in is surplus labor. The surplus labor becomes the property of the owner by virtue of his ownership on the means of production or property, and he can utilize it as he pleases. This is how exploitation arises. Exploitation is the process by which a minority section, by virtue of their ownership on the means of production, extracts for themselves the fruits of the surplus labor. Those who own the means of production are able to appropriate the major share of the product, and thus it becomes possible for them to live on the fruits of the labor of others. In other words, to exploit others. For those who produce, exploitation therefore means that only a part of their total labor is used by them for themselves to produce their own requirements, and the rest is taken and used by another. It is the development of production and the development of property which gave rise to exploitation. Thus, those who have the means of production with them become wealthier, and those who are deprived of that become poorer. This makes the society turns into two groups, namely the rich having the ownership of the means of production and the poor who does not own any means of production and instead have to work for those who own the means. That is, the society divides into two classes. Class is a major construct and a central theme in historical materialism. We spoke about the mode of production and how property relations give rise to class division. We will look deeper into the concept of class and how the interplay between various classes acts as the key force behind social changes. Class is a major construct and one of the central themes in historical materialism. A group of people who are in the same status in terms of their relations to the means of production and hence at the same level or position in the relations of production is grouped as a class. Classes exist because properties are not social but owned by private individuals or groups of individuals. One's status with respect to the ownership on means of production and his role in the relations of production determine which class he belongs to. It has no bearing at all on one's character, personal behavior, values he believes in, his caste, creed, race, social status, nothing. Lenin, in fact, in his A Great Beginning, provides an exhaustive definition of class like this. Classes are large groups of people which differ from each other by the place they occupy in a historically definite system of social production, by their relation to the means of production, by their role in the social organization of labor, and consequently by the dimensions of the social wealth that they obtain and their method of acquiring their share of it. Classes are groups of people, one of which may appropriate the labor of another, owing to the different places they occupy in the definite system of social economy. The totality of these production relations is what constitutes the economic structure of or the foundation of a society. Hence, this economic structure is called the base structure in the parlance of the historical materialism. The social being of an individual is his position in these relations. Above this base structure, a whole set of non-economic institutions and entities like laws, codes, politics, education, etc. are formed, and together they are called the superstructure. Superstructure is the legal, political, cultural, religious and philosophical environment in which the forces of production and the relations of production interact. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political and intellectual life process in general. This is why it is said that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. The superstructure exists to help the productive relations. Superstructure that takes shape, as in all the societies, will be corresponding to its foundation on which it's built. That is the economic base structure. Or in other words, in accordance with and closely linked to the relations of production existing in those societies. When the mode of production changes in a society, the superstructure corresponding to this mode of production also changes. The general characteristics and intent of this superstructure would be, naturally, to protect, strengthen and justify the economic structure, the forces of production and relations of productions that is, it is built on. Thus, the entities, including the socio-cultural institutions of the superstructure, creates social consciousness that is in favor of and in acceptance of the existing social structure or social order. This means that in the history, the social consciousness existing in every society will be in accordance with the mode of production existing in that society. In short, it can be said that how the human history progress is determined by how the men are producing goods that is essential for their survival. Within the social relations, among the classes that are at different levels in the production relations, the class that has the property ownership exploits the labor of the other class and becomes wealthy. The class that becomes rich thus would naturally be keen to keep the production relations intact that help them to become rich in the first place. So this class would try to ensure that social laws, institutions, education, cultural forms and constructs, belief systems, rituals, religion, etc., the constituents of the superstructure are all framed and formulated so as to strengthen the economic and social structure that favor them and allow them to amass wealth through exploitation of the other classes. The cultural hegemon so created and enforced through the institutions in the superstructure play a key role in reinforcing the social consciousness in favor of the dominant class in the society. At this point, a question arises naturally that if a small section with the ownership on the means of production and thus having upper hand in the economic structure who is successfully dominating a majority who is economically at the bottom of the pyramid, what makes it possible for a minority to keep a vast majority under their control? How has it been possible in societies divided into exploiters and exploited for an exploiting minority to preserve its domination over the majority and be able to preserve the social order intact without it being destroyed by the exploited mass? The obvious answer to this question is the unique organization called state. The section that has means of production with them is coercing the larger mass who are working for them by using this special institution called state. State does the job of protecting the existing economic structure, or in other words, the prevailing relations of production in the society, and thus protects the interests of the class that has upper hand in the existing economic structure. State is an organization with power to repress and coerce and with means to exercise compulsion over the members of the society. Not only physical but mental as well through its various ideological and propaganda arms. It is not the police and other institutions of force and law alone that the state employs to maintain the existing social order, but also uses the religion and other cultural institutions of the superstructure for the purpose. Ideology is, of course, equally or more potent weapon in this war than the conventional weaponry of brute force. The class which is the beneficiary of the existing social structure tries to make the entire society in terms and at peace with the existing order and even the defenders of the existing system through ideological propaganda working hand in glove with the state apparatus. Religion has a big role to play in constructing the social consciousness as well. The priesthood that asks the dispossessed to forget about the miseries of this world with a promise of another far better land waiting for them posthumously. The texts that put the blame on the bad deeds of the past lives and preaching people to submit to the existing social hierarchies to achieve salvation are all doing the duty of protecting the prevailing order on behalf of the dominant class. By cementing in the social consciousness the divine rights of kings to rule by the will of God through various religious and political doctrines, any possibility of challenge to the kingship gets nipped in the bud. The ill effects of the social structure in the form of power hierarchies and differential privileges based on the race, caste, etc. are all portrayed as God's will, making the marginalized to resign to the reality of social injustice and accepting on their own the social order as natural and inevitable. Many times the rights of the hunters to hunt are so deeply embedded in the consciousness of those who are hunted that they even start thinking it as their privilege to be pursued by their hunters. The superstructure thus develops ideological, philosophical and divine justifications and premises as appropriately to fortify and protect the existing economic structure and the class differentiations inherent in there. Hence, the transition from one social system to another is not at all an easy or simple, smooth process. The ruling class is ousted from the power only through prolonged struggle arising out of the class conflicts. And it is this power transfer which is called revolution in historical materialism parlance. Revolution in historical materialism means the overthrow of a ruling class which defends existing relations of production and the conquest of state power by a class which is interested in establishing new relations of production. What are the motivational factors behind such revolutions? What makes one social structure to crumble and another one to come up in its place? For example, how did slavery, where a small minority exploited a vast majority by subduing them and making them their slaves, vanish and a feudal society emerged in its place, despite having the protection of the state as well as the superstructure institutions? How did kingship, where the kings had unquestioned powers and the support of various institutions and doctrines that made kingship divine and projected a king as the representative of the God on earth, gave way to democratic societies? Nobody who lived under the rule of monarchs would have ever imagined, even in their wildest dreams, that there would come a time when kingship is a story of the past. No slave lived in the slave societies would have dared to hope that even their far generations down the lane would ever be freed from a system where men enslaved their fellow beings and sold in the markets like animals. If so, then how did the revolutions of the past happen and what were the motivations and forces behind those changes? What are the drivers of social changes? What motivates a social system to transition from one to another? As per historical materialism, the driving force for the change is men's ongoing effort to increase the production to attain material surplus and their attempt to constantly advance productive forces to support the same. In this process, existing relations of production or the social structure is overthrown as and when it acts as fetters, obstructing the further development of the productive forces. The class that is impacted due to the material scarcity within the prevailing system leads the struggle to overthrow the relations and to replace it with another productive relation that's more conducive for the advancement of productive forces. Let's look at it in more detail. As we know, men are busy working on their nature to sustain their lives and improve their material conditions. They are constantly looking to enhance the quality of their lives, producing goods and services to satisfy their needs as prioritized in Maslow's pyramid. In an effort to increase the productivity and efficiency with which they can carry out this production process, men is in constant pursuit of inventing and developing new tools, machines, technology, knowledge, skills, etc., etc. In other words, men try to continuously develop and advance the forces of production. However, at a certain stage of this development process, the prevailing production relations will start acting as fetters or draggers or blockers on further development of forces of production. When relations of production become a bottleneck coming in the way of further development of forces of production, they become stagnant, and its further development will not be possible unless and until the relations of production that acts as fetters are removed. Thus, the need for advancing productive forces acts as the motivator for changing the existing relations of production or the prevailing social order. For example, imagine that you are employing someone to work in your plantain farm. Assume that he earns an amount X every day as his daily wage. The relation between you and him in this case is that of a landowner and a wage worker. In this relationship, as far as the worker is concerned, how good your harvest is makes no difference to him. Whether your farm produces 1,000 units or 10,000 units, his wage is still fixed at X per day. What this implies is that the worker will carry no special interest in increasing the production of your crop. He won't be interested in exploring new methods and means of enhancing the productivity, like trying out high-yield seed varieties, developing new tools, technologies, or farming methods, etc. In essence, the production relation, landlord-wise wage worker, comes in the way of development of the forces of production in this instance. Now, instead, consider engaging the worker as a tiller in your farm and agree to share the produce with him 50-50. In this relation, a good harvest would mean better returns for him, as an increase in the crop would increase his share as well. He will be keen to do everything within his control to increase the yield, like deploying latest farming methods, technologies, planting high-yield varieties, etc. As it is evident, the new relation is helping the development of the forces of production, while the earlier one was acting as a fetter, blocking its advancement. Of course, the person is not performing these actions consciously to improve the forces of production. Rather, he is doing it for increasing his income or enhancing his material life. However, in this process, the forces of production also get developed. It is the change in the relations of production what paved the way for the advancement of forces of production in this instance. Thus, it is the development of forces of production and the corresponding changes in the relations of production what drives the progress of the society or the social changes. This forms the crux of historical materialism. As it suggests, the primary forces behind the forward march of human history as the social process of production of material goods, or in other words, the economic activities, and the constant struggle against social relations that come in the way of its advancement. The relation with the means of production for the landlord who owns the land and the worker who is only working on the land are obviously different. For example, in the feudal system, the serf has no rights on the land and he doesn't even have rights to work under any other landlord. Or in other words, he doesn't even own his own labor power. In the parlance of historical materialism, those two individuals belong to two different classes. But if the production has to happen, then these two, the landlord and the serf, must work together. Either landlord or serf alone cannot produce. However, what is the inherent character of the relations between these two? Interest of the landlord is to increase his share as much possible. He always wants to increase the production and give out as minimum possible share to the serf so as to maximize his profit. The serf, on the other hand, wants to increase his share and improve his living conditions or economic conditions. That is, opposite interests are what leading these two individuals or classes. But both need to come together to make the production. So the unity of the two sections or forces is mandatory to enable the production process, while at the same time both of them are working with opposite interest and in opposite direction. That is, the key character of their relation is that of unity and struggle at the same time. If we examine the landlord-tiller relation mentioned earlier, we can see that their interests are again of opposite nature. If neither tiller agrees for 30% share instead of 50%, the landlord will have no qualm in engaging with the one who is willing to give him 70% of the produce. Thus, both the sections are always looking for increasing their share and thus are in struggle with each other. But at the same time, they stand together to make production possible. Without them standing together, the production is not possible. Without a landlord, there is no tiller and vice versa. Such forces are termed as contradiction in the parlance of historical materialism. The word contradiction in historical materialism or in dialectical method in general has a special meaning that in order to qualify the relation between two forces or phenomena or objects as contradictory, they should not only be acting in opposite direction or with opposite interest and thus are engaged in struggle with each other, but also it should be impossible for the processes or the objects in question to exist without their unity or togetherness. Such forces or phenomena are said to be in a dialectical relation with each other. In dialectics, contradiction has a relational meaning. Contradiction in dialectics are the oppositions that are necessary for the existence of each other and yet at the same time are destructive of each other. For example, a master is the contradiction of a servant and vice versa. A person cannot be a master without a servant and a person cannot be a servant without a master. Both a master and a servant can only be defined in relation to each other. It is the struggle between such inherent dialectical forces within a system that is responsible for all the motions in the universe, both natural as well as social processes. In social relations, based on the relation with the means of production, different classes emerge and these classes develop dialectical relationship, that of unity and struggle at the same time. Historical materialism establishes that it is the struggle between these opposing classes which is responsible for the development of forces of production, corresponding changes in the relations of production and thus for the social changes. That is what it means when Marx says the history hitherto has been that of class struggle. For example, in the feudal system, as long as the relations of production continue as landlord-wise serfs, a factory owner cannot open his manufacturing unit and get workers to work for him, as all the workers are bound to the landlord with no rights on their labor power and no rights to decide for whom they can work and hence cannot work for the factory owner. Factory owner needs wage labor, workers who will work in his factory for a wage, while the landlord will not be ready to release his serfs as that will affect his income. So, in order for the owners, or in other words, the capitalists, to establish factories, the relations of production in the feudal mode of production, landlord-wise serf, need to be dismantled. And a new capitalist proletariat relations of production need to be established. That is, a new social system must be in place where people can sell their labor power as a commodity to whomever they want to. Only then the capitalists can buy the labor power of those freed workers and run their mass production shops and assembly lines. Such a change will certainly be opposed by the landlords of feudal system, as this change is not in their interest. Here the class which is keen to change the feudal system to a capitalist system so as to enhance production and leverage the opportunity to make more profit, and the existing landlord class of the feudal system engage in struggle with each other. Feudal system enables only limited production because of the underdeveloped forces of production, and hence people face material scarcity, a trigger for advancing the productive forces. Similarly, to enhance the material living condition, the serf in the feudal system endures in struggle with the landlord class. These struggles intensify and work as catalysts for the transition into a social system that allows further development of forces of production. As we have seen earlier, the same relations of production which were supportive of development of forces of production at one stage start acting as fetters or blockers to the development of those forces at a different stage of growth. So, in order to continue the development of the forces of production further, it would be mandatory to break the relations of production that have turned into fetters from being enablers once. While the classes which are beneficiaries of the existing system oppose the changes, the classes which are toiling within the system, suffering from the material scarcity and exploitation, start rebelling and intensify the struggle with the opposing classes. At the peak of this class struggle, the old system gives way to the new system. The new social system, or the new relations of production or mode of production that emerge following a revolution, of course gives rise to new classes. If it was a master and slave in a slave society, the new feudal system gives birth to lords and serfs. In the capitalist system, the class polarization would be as capitalist or bourgeoisie versus proletariat or workers. It may be noted that the class which are equipped to take forward the development of forces of production in each epoch in the history is the one that emerges as the ruling class of the time. It was the capitalist class, the one responsible for driving the industrial revolution that fueled the collapse of the feudal system and marked the beginning of the capitalist order, which emerged as the ruling class in the resulting new social system. It is when the development of the forces of production got stalled under the feudal relations, being unable to mass produce to meet the material needs of the growing population, that the lord-serf relations that acted as a fetter was set aside in favor of more progressive bourgeoisie proletariat relations, which is more conducive for the further development of the forces of production. The new system, of course, does not appear on one fine morning, all of a sudden from nowhere, replacing the old system. The seeds of a new system make its appearance within the old system itself, where it germinates and overcomes the old when the conditions become appropriate. To quote Marx again, no social formation ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. What are the different modes of production human history has witnessed so far in the course of its journey? And what kind of a social structure man is destined to build at the end of his journey, searching for a system that would emancipate him from all the bonds and allow him to realize his full potential? We have discussed about the key motivations and forces which drive social changes. Looking closely at man's historical journey thus far, historical materialism predicts the inevitability of an egalitarian society in which man will be freed from all the chains. We will look at what historical materialism predicts about where the human history is headed and what is man's ultimate destiny. In the human history, as we know, at least 4 epochs with the distinct modes of production and corresponding social structure can be identified. Closely studying these social systems and their continuous progress from a primitive system to a more advanced, historical materialism draws the conclusion that the history ultimately should arrive at a social system which is devoid of class discrimination and exploitation, what it calls as the communist social order. The four distinct modes of production man has built over the ages in the human history are Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and capitalist modes of production. These modes of production have given rise to respective social orders or social systems in the form of primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, respectively. Asiatic mode of production is considered as the oldest form of mode of production and is known as primitive communism. It is the mode of production of an age where the world was sparsely populated. The forces of production were hardly developed, and for the most part, people lived by hunting and gathering their food using primitive tools and implements. In this mode of production that existed in the early stages of human history, people worked together with hardly any division of labor existing and with all the property held in common, with no individual having any ownership rights on the means of production. The last stage of this epoch must have seen the beginning of the emergence of early forms of agriculture. The ancient mode of production, the second one, is characterized by private ownership of land and more developed forces of production compared to the previous epoch, and the commodity production was being carried out by the slaves. This is the social order within which classes emerged for the first time, and it marked the beginning of the history of class antagonism. History post the breakup of the primitive communes was the history of class struggles, the conflicts of material interests of different classes. As the ancient mode of production gave way to the feudal system, slaves ceased to be widely used for labor and their place was taken by serfs and other workers paying their dues to the landowners. The fourth and modern epoch of capitalist mode of production is characterized by mass commodity production and workers who are completely alienated from the means of production, selling their labor power to capitalists and working as wage laborers in massive production enterprises. Capitalism, the current mode of production, and the corresponding social system is dominated by private property and markets where producers are sold for profit. This epoch is also characterized by increased commoditization and rapid growth in forces of production. To quote Marx, in broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal and modern bourgeoisie modes of production can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. The bourgeoisie relations of production are the last antagonistic form of social process of production. He had also suggested that the productive forces developing in the boom of bourgeoisie society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. Two key course-changing developments had happened in the production process in the history so far. First one is agriculture. Agriculture evolved after men spent tens of thousands of years hunting and gathering with the primitive techniques and tools, leading a nomadic life. In fact, as mentioned earlier, the class division in the society happened with emergence of agriculture, and the history from this point turns to be the history of class struggles. The second key change is the emergence of modern industry that uses energy from a source which doesn't involve human or animal labor. Example, steam engine, electricity, etc. It is this revolutionary development in the forces of production that made the mode of production to transition into the industrial era and gave birth to capitalism. Private property, markets, finance capital, wealth concentration all began to manifest in their higher and more advanced forms along with the growth of the capitalistic social order. It is under capitalism that the development of productive forces has been most rapid compared to any of the earlier modes of production. This is primarily because the capitalism paves way for huge wealth creation through surplus production, profiteering, and accumulation at a very large scale, enabled by the industrial mass production. Massive surplus thus accumulated enables the capitalist to in turn reinvest in the process of developing the forces of production further, say development of new technology, machines, etc., in quest of further extending the profit. Thus, under capitalism, the production forces attain unprecedented development, and it gave hope, in fact, for the first time in the history of mankind, of a possible state of material surplus that can satisfy the need of all. However, in reality, as we know, this has not happened. Though the advanced state of productive forces has provided the mankind an ability and opportunity to produce for all, the special relations under capitalism instead enable all that wealth to be concentrated in the hands of a few who owns the means of production, or in other words, the capitalist class, and leave the majority thoroughly deprived. The working class is left with a very nominal share that is just sufficient to sustain their lives. Couple of dozens of billionaires in the world own more than the total wealth that 3.8 billion people at the bottom together possess, reveals the magnitude of the massive inequality in the equity distribution. With their lives becoming increasingly miserable, the affected class is bound to intensify its struggle against the class that is responsible for its plight in an effort to topple the existing social order in favor of a more favorable and equitable system. The premise of historical materialism's insistence that eventually a communist society is bound to replace the current bourgeoisie social order is that the inherent character of capitalist social order, enabling a minority to amass the major chunk of the wealth produced socially through exploitation at the cost of a majority who are left to toil to meet even their basic needs, makes capitalism unsuitable for establishing an egalitarian society, and hence it is inevitable that it be toppled. Thus, it is natural that historical materialism that established the inevitability of a better egalitarian social system devoid of suffering and exploitation kindled hope and excitement in the minds of millions and emerged as the revolutionary philosophy of the dispossessed. We saw that the ownership right on the means of production, or in other words, private property, is what is giving birth to the classes and the antagonism among the classes. If everyone has the equal ownership rights on the means of production, then the question of some people getting more share of the produce by virtue of owning the means of production and another set of people who are denied the ownership having to settle for a nominal share will not arise. Under such a social order, everyone participating in the process of production will get their share of the produce according to their contribution in terms of the work they put in. Exploitation, where a majority do the work and a small section take possession of the fruit of that labor due to their ownership rights on the means of production, would come to an end in the system. Such a social system, as envisaged by the historical materialism, is what is termed as socialism. Under a socialist system, where the forces of production would continue its development under the new relations of production. The underlying principle that would govern the participation in production process and the distribution of wealth will be from each according to his ability to each according to his work. Each one would be free to decide for self on the quantum of work he would contribute to the production process and earn accordingly. In socialism, labor power is no longer considered as a commodity to be bought and sold. The person who receives according to his work is not considered as receiving the price of the labor power he has imparted to the process, but as receiving his share of the social product according to the contribution he has made to the social production process. The advancement in productive forces, or in other words, the enhancement in the productivity made possible by the development of science and technology, while is used for further profiteering under capitalist order, would result in shortening of the working day under socialism. This would provide more leisure time for the people to engage in activities that help in their all-round personal development and fulfillment. In the communist society, where the forces of production achieve its maximum development and the production relations do not act as fetters for its continued development, the society restructures itself, aligning with the paradigm from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. This would ensure that the needs of everyone are satisfied irrespective of an individual's contribution to the production process. In a communist society, all will have an equal right to satisfy their needs. Of course, in a society where there is material surplus and the people don't need to be worried about satisfying their basic needs, where each one has liberty and equal opportunity to pursue their passion and a path of their liking according to their skills and interests, people would naturally be matured enough to be self-aware of their needs and the share of produce required to satisfy those needs. Historical materialism offers a high-level blueprint for the human pursuit towards establishing such an egalitarian society. It establishes that the capitalist societies, where the forces of production have attained its highest degree of development and hence produces sufficient material surplus, but also at the same time witness highest level of class antagonism due to the inherent skewed wealth distribution, and thus the productive relations turn into fetters for further development of the production forces, will be faced with intense class struggle and eventually will be ousted and replaced by a socialist system through revolution led by the proletariat class. It is worth mentioning at this juncture that socialism or communism does not mandate that the social products be equally distributed among the members. Distribution of social products equally is not within the paradigm of socialism or communism. The share of the produce distributed would be unequal in both socialism as well as in communism, as the amount and quality of work contributed will be different from person to person, and hence the share of the produce distributed also will vary in the former, and in the later, in communism, the need will vary from person to person, and thus what share each one will take also will be different. The equality that communism promises to bring in is the equal opportunity for everyone for self-development. In the communist society, nobody is restricted or forcefully bound to a particular domain or work. An individual will be free to develop self in any sphere of his liking. There would be no realm of human affairs that is beyond the reach for anyone, irrespective of his or her caste, color, race, status, or anything else. As Marx stated in German Ideology, in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Unquote. As the means of production is socialized in the new social order, the very factor that allows one class to dominate the other, the private property, vanishes. Thus, the differentiation of those with ownership rights on the means of production and those without disappears. Since the ownership is same for all on the means of production, there will be no more class difference, or in other words, there will be no basis for the existence of class, and hence class itself disappears, making the communist society a classless one. In short, with the property being socialized, the source to draw economic power for one group as against another is taken away, and thus the basis of class relations goes away, and so does class struggle. Since there would be no more class struggle, which is the fundamental driving force for the social changes, the communist society where production relations do not act as fetters for development of productive forces will stay. As the property interests of any particular class need not be protected, there will be no role for the state, and thus the state would lose its relevance and would wither away in a communist social order. Before closing, the fundamental findings of historical materialism can thus be summarized as below in Marx onwards. 1. The experience of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases of the development of production. Second, the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's socialism. Third, this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society, that is, communist society. With that closing note, we will end this course here. Thank you very much for listening.